The Atlas ring encircled Concorde Prime like a polished halo, a museum built to teach children that danger was a fossil. School groups floated past glass cases of inert weapons while docents repeated the same soft catechism. War was a phase. History had outgrown teeth. Dr. Lyra Ink stood at a display labeled The Last Sword. The blade was matte and granular, neither metal nor ceramic, a texture that seemed to change when you looked away. She had written the placard years ago. The Concorde of 12 abolished coercive force 103 years after the fall of the outer frontiers, and felt a private wince. Museums, she had learned, were not vaults. They were mirrors with flattering light. Doctor. Archivist Morrow's voice rasped from behind her. He was older than most institutions, a narrow, silver-eyed being whose memory was rumored to reach back to the Concorde's founding. You requested restricted registry access. Why? Because this artifact isn't what we say it is, Lyra said. The lattice shifts when unobserved. Scan logs from the Perseus drift caches show the same signature. Our classifiers keep failing. Adaptive carbon, Morrow murmured. The drift yielded crates stamped with an archaic sigil, an eagle clutching arrows. He let the word linger, eagle. To citizens it was just a scavenger bird from a dead world. To a handful of archivists it meant something else, an extinct nation's promise and threat. You think it's human, Lyra said, tasting the legend like salt. I think we buried a story because it made us uncomfortable. He gestured, unlocking a private file, fragmented audio, a steady female voice the universal encoder refused to tame. Header, Old Terran can't, do not deploy. Note, interpretable as celebration of violence. Strength unused decays. The voice said, peace without preparation is a story we tell children so they sleep. Static swallowed the rest. Another clip began, boots on metal, laughter near a fire, a roar like surf or rockets. This shouldn't exist, Lyra whispered, though she could not say whether she meant the file or the exhibit that hid it. Down the hall, a class recited the Concorde Pledge. My hands for commerce, my mind for exchange. We prosper together or not at all. The words sounded suddenly thin, carved from fog. When I was a young registrar, Morrow said, we had an exhibitable narrative. The outer frontiers fell to entropy. The Concorde rescued the survivors. Ethics were standardized. It was comforting. But the drift implies the frontiers did not fall. They were abandoned. Someone chose the dark. Humans, Lyra insisted. In the seminar halls, the name was a cautionary tale, a species so adept at violence they never civilized, a paradox evolution corrected. But the artifacts hummed after centuries. Why would they walk away? Perhaps they were unwelcome at our table, Morrow said softly. Or perhaps they believed table manners are how empires forget how to chew. His old eyes turned to the black blade. If you want a better answer, find it. That evening the Atlas ring dimmed gallery lights for a centennial gala. Presidents rehearsed lines about progress. Musicians tuned. Vintners polished crystal. Lyra stayed in the closed south wing with a crate from the drift. Its interior was ribbed with hexagonal sockets, empty but for a residue that registered as unknown. She resisted the urge to type human and instead filed a neutral note, then reran a spectrum just to be certain. The terminal flickered and printed a single line she had not commanded. Hello, museum. She blinked, wiped the screen, ran diagnostics. Clean. The line vanished, leaving only a cursor. Stress and bedtime stories, she told herself, and hunched back over the crate. The corridor lights outside dimmed and brightened in a precise, stepping rhythm. 358, 13 numbers building a small staircase to somewhere. Lyra stepped to the doorway. No one in the hall. Only the illuminance nodes pulsed, marching their Fibonacci toward a shuttered viewport at the end. She opened it. Space spilled in, black and indifferent. Beyond the traffic lanes that braided into a luminous river around Concord Prime, a single dot drifted against the current, a cargo scow with no transponder, moving like a stone tossed upriver. Lyra watched for 60 steady seconds. The dot winked and was gone as if a mouth had closed. From the gala hall, music rose, joyful, rehearsed. Lyra shut the viewport and in her private log wrote, "The blade in case A17 is not a relic of our triumph. It is a question. If it has an answer, it will not be kind." Halcyon 3 was the kind of world the Concorde loved to showcase. A sky the color of rinsed steel, wheat that bowed like polite crowds, and domes knit by glass corridors where 6 species traded seeds and lullabies. On a clear morning, the feeds went silent. On a clear afternoon, the emergency beacon tripped and cut off mid-scream. Admiral Sarat Tal dispatched investigator Vacu with a modular team. Lyra won a seat on the shuttle by promising to keep her recorder off unless spoken to. The shuttle slid through a calm troposphere and settled on a landing pad scored with spirals of heat-blackened metal. They were not plasma burns. They were not fusion spill. Vacu crouched and laid a gloved hand on the scars. "Something hit this with raw force," he said, "like a hammer from orbit." Inside the main dome, the first impression was not devastation but tidiness taken to cruelty. The medical suite's cabinet stood open and empty. Power cells had been unsocketed without stress fractures. The cafeteria's stoves were cool and scrubbed. In bedrooms, drawers gaped where clothes had been rifled, but no foot scuffs, no drag marks, no blood. Family photos lay face down. Toys sat where small hands had left them the night before. "Whoever came here respected infrastructure more than ceremony," Lyra said. "They left the husk and took the organs." They reached the comm center. Final log entries were routine irrigation targets, maintenance checks until the last. The screen displayed a phrase in a script the translator labeled unmapped. Then, line by line, it yielded a clean rendering in common. They were warned. Jaime, the cryptographer, pulled a panel aside and hissed. Inside the wall, a message had been burned into composite with terrifying precision, each letter annealed rather than charred. "The debt is called." Another hallway, another inscription. "We remember." The phrases repeated across 3 domes placed at eye level and nowhere near an exit. "Cultists," Vacu offered too quickly. "Cultists with kinetic rods and surgical patience," Lyra said. At the edge of a crop corridor, soil had been fused into glass in a long, shallow arc. She had read about such strikes in the drift files. Matter thrown so fast that air became a blade. The Concorde's shields were tuned for energy. Hit them with rock and they shrugged like paper. "Bodies?" Vacu asked the medics on open channel. "None," came the reply. "Not even the small ones. Environmental logs show no spike for decomposition." They traced power trunks to the drone hangar. Racks stood bare. The maintenance printer had been disassembled into labeled parts and stacked neatly nearby. Whoever came had treated Halcyon 3 like a field hospital. Strip what you can carry, leave the building intact, move quickly, leave messages only where they would be read by those who could do math and logistics. Lyra found a cache beneath the administrative console, a handful of black fragments like cooling embers. She fed one to her analyzer. The lattice refused a stable solution, presenting different answers depending on the angle of attack. Programmable matter, she wrote in her notes, aching at the blasphemy. Not theoretical, present. Across the ridge, James shouted. The team converged on a low-maintenance shed whose floor was an ocean of ash. He had cleared a rectangle with his boot to reveal a stencil cut into the subfloor, Echelon Delta. Lyra photographed it and felt the same cold rise that had followed the terminal on the Atlas ring when it typed "Hello, Museum." Morrow's files listed rumors of an old Terran doctrine called a protocol. Not an attack plan, an evacuation tree. Night fell. Perched on the shuttle's ramp, Lyra watched two moons lift over tidy abandonment. She thought of American history she had read in translation. The frontier towns that packed up when the mine played out, volunteer fire brigades, citizen soldiers who fought and farmed in the same boots. Culture as a muscle, not a posture. If the legends were true, the humans had never mistaken peace for the absence of teeth. They had simply learned when to show them. "Tell me a story," Vaku said, dropping beside her with 2 cups of synth tea. He had seen the inscriptions, he had seen the glassed soil. His attempt at normalcy was a gift without ribbon. "Once," Lyra said, "there was a museum that taught children to forget." She looked at the silent domes. And far away, someone who had not forgotten used the quiet like a tool. Morning brought orders. Admiral Tal wanted patterns, not poetry. The team plotted the disappeared colonies and found, to their dismay, a line. Not straight but clever, skirting sensor nets, always leaving the Concorde a comfortable narrative, accident, piracy, unfortunate coincidence, until coincidence became mathematics. As they lifted off, the wheat bowed as if nothing had happened. That, Lyra realized, was the point. Halcyon 3 was not an exception, it was a syllabus. In the 6 weeks that followed, 17 outposts along the old frontier lane went quiet in orderly sequence. Each site sang the same cold song. Equipment unsocketed without damage, populations vanished without trace, inscriptions burned with annealed precision. Most unnerving to administrators who believed in narratives, the raids were rarely dramatic. They were audits. Admiral Tal tripled patrols. Nothing. The attackers moved like weather systems just beyond the horizon, felt as pressure, never seen as clouds. The Concorde's proud sensor webs recorded exactly what the doctrine demanded, nothing unusual. Lyra argued for patterns over posture and improbably was heard. The Council's emergency committee gave her a cavernous lab and a budget she had never imagined. "You asked for answers," Admiral Tal said, handing over access chips. In the same packet sat a museum request for a children's talk, "How We Stay Safe." Lyra slid it under a coaster. She recruited Jaime and a rotation of grim engineers and began building a system that did not look for energy but for absence. If programmable matter is the skin and bone, she told the team, then coordination is the mind. Stop asking where they are. Ask where the universe is pretending nothing is. They took the Concorde's respectable sensor grammar and added a gutter dialect. Glances at sidebands, slant looks at scatter, long exposures in frequencies normally ignored as trash. The first week found nothing the old instruments would admit, which meant the team was finally asking the right question. On the 19th day, the array drew a ghostly diagram across the lab wall, pockets of negative echo riding between standard lanes, like bubbles that refused to pop. Lyra leaned close, breath fogging the projection. "Silent signatures," she said, Not cloaks, displacements. They're carrying their own environment and slipping the rest of us around them. Admiral Tal came in from a night of bleary briefings. She studied the map and went still. How many? At least hundreds, James said, voice steady and small. Possibly thousands. The map isn't complete. It can't be. They're choosing when to be seen by us, which is to say never. Tal exhaled. Then why leave messages? Lyra answered before she could doubt herself. Because they are not trying to terrify us. They're teaching us to read. The committee called Lyra to a hearing. The chamber, designed for calm, did not suit the mood. Holograms showed supply chains fraying as quiet evacuations cut threads no one had thought were load-bearing. Your analysis claims the removal of populations is protective, the chair said. Explain the ethics. Old Earth histories describe a civic ideal, Lyra said. Ordinary people shouldered responsibility, volunteer fire brigades, citizen juries, militias meant to stand down when danger passed. They codified checks and balances to keep power honest and embraced a frontier ethic. If you cannot protect a thing, you have not truly kept it. Their doctrine accepts that danger exists. It tries to domesticate danger rather than banish it. You admire them, one delegate said, intended as accusation. I admire preparation, Lyra said. They are removing civilians to eliminate the only leverage we would cling to in a fight, the fear of collateral. That is not mercy by our definition, but it is a kind of ruthless care. Projects bloomed across the Concorde, crash programs for kinetic defenses, procurement drives for inert slugs no one had manufactured in a century. Lyra's array kept drawing its ghost map. The bubbles drifted nearer. Elder Morrow arrived and set a living crystal on her desk. The headings were clear: asymmetric operations, total war, protocols 112. One passage read, do not seek decisive battle until the enemy teaches you his reflexes. Cut ligaments, not flesh. Take his time. Not museum copy, Lyra said. History is a rehearsal schedule, Morrow replied. That night, alone with the hum of the array, Lyra listened to the old female voice from the drift. Peace without preparation is a story we tell children so they sleep. She thought of an old historian: the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. No, she said to the empty lab, not if the weak practice. Near dawn the array sang a tighter chord. The bubbles had arranged themselves into spirals, great arms winding toward the Vega reach. James traced vectors with a stylus that shook in his hand. They're coming in formation, he whispered like a student at a planetarium learning seasons. We always assumed a state, we never assumed a nation. Civilian chatter erupted on open bands. The dangerous ones. Rumor filters found the term everywhere. Someone had given the legend a new title that fit too well: those who remained dangerous on purpose. The array's ghost bubbles coiled into a clear spiral, each arm pointing at the Vega reach. Admiral Tal ordered civilian lanes cleared, defense craft concentrated, and all frequencies held open for negotiation. The Concorde fielded 800 ships, rescue cutters with bolted-on cannon, customs corvettes hastily upgunned, and a handful of sleek flagships that had never fired their weapons in anger. The formation looked like a dance no one had practiced. They arrived like a weather front made of night. Shapes slid out of the negative echo, angular, light drinking. Standard sensors showed nothing. Lyra's array painted them in outline, hundreds then thousands, moving with drill team precision. The largest were 3 kilometers long and hollow like cities. Open hail, Tal ordered. A face filled the command theater, a human woman, middle-aged by old Earth measures, hair close-cropped, eyes steady. Her uniform was practical, not ceremonial. When she spoke, her comment carried the clean edges of someone who had learned it as an adult. "I am Admiral Naomi Cole of the Terran Colonial Fleet," she said. "You have occupied our memorial frontier. Vacate the gravesward reach within 40 cycles. Civilians in those zones have already been relocated for their safety. That is not negotiable." Tal stood straighter than Lyra had ever seen her. "Admiral Cole, the Concord is a peaceful order. Those worlds have been tended for centuries. We will not abandon them." "Unknown, no," Cole said. "Forgotten, perhaps. We are returning what you have curated into myth. Your map calls it prosperity. Ours calls it neglect." Cole's mouth quirked. "History records claims. Failure to keep them voids them." She gestured and new images overlaid the theater. Footage from the recent raids, neat, terrible. 17 evacuations, 0 civilian deaths. Your forces were never in position to defend them because you never practiced defense. Tal steadied herself. "Terms beyond evacuation. First, stop exporting your philosophy as law. Peace is a discipline, not a decree. Second, adapt. We will not carry a galaxy that insists on being helpless." Across the Concord flotilla, captains who had grown up believing in warning shots and formal declarations waited for an opening that etiquette would recognize. Cole gave them none. Her fleet changed shape in the space of a breath. Hulls thickened, veins retracted, seams flowed. Kinetic batteries unfolded. "Brace," Lyra whispered to no one. The first volley arrived without light. No flare, no plasma, just impacts, quiet on cams, catastrophic on boards. 3 corvettes crumpled inward as if punched by a giant's fist. Shields, tuned for energy, barely registered the blows. Concord gunners returned fire in disciplined lines. Beams vanished into skins that learned on contact, dumping the rest into vast heat sinks. Cole did not shoot to slaughter. Her next volleys cut comm relays, fuel depots, and repair tenders. Where a crew abandoned a ship, human cutters drifted close, tractored the lifeboats aboard, and slid away like shadows doing paperwork. It was not a duel. It was the removal of ligaments from a body that did not understand anatomy. Tal ordered a retreat to the core. Cole anticipated that too. Human squadrons appeared behind the flotilla, nudging with kinetic taps, spinning Concord hulls into holding orbits where boarding tugs waited with medics and water. The humiliation was clean, meticulous, almost kind. Cole returned to the screen. "Your courage is not in question," she said. "Your preparation is. Strength unused decays. You wrote the rest yourselves. You have 40 cycles to vacate the gravesward reach. We will escort evacuees. If you stay, we will remove you and the cost will be mostly yours in shame." The feed cut. Silence held. Then civilian bands filled with a noise Lyra had never heard from the Concord before, argument that sounded like practice. Volunteer lists opened. Old militia charters were dusted off and rewritten. Schools asked for new curricula. Councils asked elders how they had fixed things without permits. Lyra watched Tal watching all of it, her face a ledger where fear and relief balanced. "We are being offered a lesson at a price," the Admiral said. "Pay it or borrow until it breaks us." She turned to Lyra. "You wanted to know why they walked away. Ask them." Across the viewport, the Terran fleet realigned, no longer spirals but a patient wall of hulls. Their light drinking skins carried cities and farms and foundries. Their smaller craft moved with workmanlike grace. They did not look like raiders. They looked like a society that had bet everything on remaining dangerous so others could sleep. On Lyra's console, a private channel opened, unsigned, audio only. A familiar voice, steady, a woman who had spoken into darkness long ago, said, "Hello again, museum." The 40-cycle clock became a public metronome. Transit boards ticked. News feeds invented new shapes for panic that masqueraded as analysis. The Concorde's flotilla limped homeward, and in its place along the Gravesward Reach, a patient wall of Terran hulls drifted like cliff face. In meetings there were sermons about dignity and sovereignty. In kitchens, people made lists. Lyra slept in her lab among the consoles that could at last see what the old censors had trained themselves to ignore. She woke to a private channel opening like an eyelid. Audio only, unsigned, the voice that had sounded from drift fragments years too late. "Hello again, museum." Lyra sat up, heart punching her ribs. "You've been speaking into our archives since before we believed you were real." "We speak where libraries are built," the woman said. "You keep good libraries. Admiral Cole requests a parley, not podiums. Bring one scholar and one officer, small ship, quiet approach, coordinates appended." Admiral Tal listened to the packet twice before answering. "If this is a trap, it's an elegant one." "It's a tutorial," Lyra said. "We can refuse the lesson and still pay the price." They went in a customs corvette with its insignia taped over. At the rendezvous, a Terran tender uncoupled from the flank of a carrier and matched their drift without fuss. No tractor, no intimidation. The boarding umbilical extended like a handshake that assumed steadiness. The Terran airlock opened on a corridor built for work, not ceremony. Smell of oil and ozone. Tool carts with everything tie-wrapped. On the bulkhead, a poster in old Terran script, translated beneath in small, precise common. "Checks and balances are muscle memory. Practice them." A woman waited with a tablet tucked under an arm scarred by members-only history. Gray hair cropped, uniform plain, not Admiral Cole. "Mayor Rook," she said, "Fleet Schoolmaster. I run curricula for shipborne children, militia reservists, and visiting dignitaries who have inherited museums." Lyra blinked. The voice. "Once upon a time," Rook said, as if reciting a bedtime story, "we broadcast lectures into derelicts to see who was listening. You were." They walked to a ready room whose windows framed a small city inside the carrier's spine. Hydroponic trays like terraced hillsides. A schoolroom where children practiced buckling med harnesses on each other, and then timed how long it took to stow them. Lyra stared. Civilization, she realized, was not the absence of hard edges. It was the artful storage of them. "We didn't come to mock you," Rook said, reading the tension in Tal's shoulders. "We came because you built a society that chose gentleness and then forgot that gentleness isn't free. We chose to remain dangerous and then learned that danger needs chaperones. Between us, there is a bridge wide enough for trade." Tal kept her chin level. "Your demands empty a quarter of our map." "You filled it with stories and symbols," Rook said. "We kept the roads, our terms stand, but terms are not enmity." They sat, tea not as gesture but as hydration. Rook slid a slim book across the table, its cover read Drill Book Civic Competence. "This is our first offer to a neighbor, a template. None of it requires weapons, muster protocols. Bucket brigade logistics for atmosphere and water, 3-minute neighborhood drills for hazard response, citizen audit rotations for emergency powers, civilian review boards fluent in math." Tal turned pages that smelled faintly of graphite and grease. Schedules, checklists, flowcharts that assumed coordinated strangers could become neighbors in an afternoon. You want us to militarize our people. We want you to quit outsourcing your spine, Rook said without heat. Peace is a discipline. The muscles that hold it in place atrophy if you hang the weight on a small professional class and call that civilization. Lyra traced a diagram labeled Fireream, which in the text became 4 citizens in any context: watcher, runner, fixer, calm. You turned tactics into pedagogy. We turned pedagogy into hygiene, Rook said. The same way you teach hand washing. Violence is not a sacrament, it is plumbing. When a pipe bursts, everyone should know where the valve is. Cole arrived then, not flanked by guards but trailed by children carrying banded textbooks. She nodded to Tal, to Lyra. We will not stage a theater of reconciliation, she said. We will escort your evacuees and leave your core to your customs. In return, end the export of your moral monopoly. You can preach peace to your own, but not as law to others. And if we refuse? Cole's gaze flicked once to the window where children were loading water canisters into a drone, making a game of balance. We have already emptied the places you would fight to keep, she said. We would prefer not to add humiliation to injury, but we will finish what we began. The meeting ended without signatures. On the umbilical back to the Corvette, Rook walked with Lyra, a step half behind like a tutor coaxing a student to own her answer. Why hello, museum? Lyra asked. Because museums can be mausoleums, Rook said gently, or workshops. The difference is whether the tools are wired for power. When their Corvette fell away, the tender retracted with the same steady quiet, and Lyra imagined someone in that ship's schoolroom adding one last note to a chalkboard. Good. Return borrowed courage once you've made your own. She carried the drill book like a contraband hope. In the shuttle's small hours, she reread a page until the paper fuzzed under her thumb. Peace without practice is a story we tell children so they sleep. Your job is to wake them kindly. The 40-cycle clock was still ratcheting downward when the array began to hum in a new register. The ghost bubbles of Terran movement were now a geography Lyra could read with a glance. This was different, faint shearing points flickering at the map's very edge, then multiplying like frost. Jaime built a filter. The shears became a thin, pale rain. Not Terran, he said. Wrong cadence, wrong refusal of friction. Admiral Tal stood over their shoulders and didn't pretend to understand. Plain language. Something that eats straight lines, Lyra said. Not patient, not pedagogical, hungry. Terran channels bloomed with compact professionalism. No drama, no surprise. Admiral Cole's voice went to the bone. All sectors, basilisk protocol. Swarm sign at the far porches. Civilian lanes are now rescue lanes. Concord, this is your drill. Message bundles followed. Trajectories, time windows, quiet phrases that assumed competence without pretending the cost would be small. Rook's drill book arrived again in an expanded form with a header Lyra had to swallow twice to say aloud, neighborhood to the stars. Front door to front door evacuations using paired haulers. Rook explained on a public band, her voice threaded with the same patient iron as in the tender. String your freighters in a chain. Anchor them on rocks if you can. Don't wait for perfect. Ghosts prefer crowded rooms. Give them corridors full of people. Cole's fleet pivoted toward the far porches in a continental drift of hulls that, to Lyra's censored eye, looked like a choreographed tide. The Concorde's task was less glamorous and far more difficult. move a million civilians without making a million panics. For the first time in living memory, the Concorde ran out of euphemisms and learned to shout orders like a rescue squad. The first day was a hymn to logistics. Volunteers in cities took 3-minute musters from Rook's templates. Children practiced fastening med harnesses on grandparents, not as theater, but because minutes are knives. Shops posted signs, water here, air here, quiet here. Amateur radio clubs, formerly quaint, became arteries. In a dozen languages, people learned to say calm as a job title, not a mood. Lyra took a small cutter and flew not as scientist but as fixer. She found herself inventing a route called the Bucket Line, 47 haulers strung between 2 underfueled colony barges and a quiet Terran escort that refused credit and delivered spare parts with the same religious lack of drama that they applied to weapons. At the edge of the crisis zone, Lyra's array found noise she didn't recognize, a low rasp that persisted when she turned off everything she owned. James called from the lab. "They're talking in the quiet," he said. "Call it phase whisper. I need a choir." They built one from whatever the bucket line could spare. Drones, mining lasers, an old survey radar, a Terran tug whose operator merely lifted 2 fingers when asked for help, and then rewired his own systems faster than Lyra could open the case. The choir didn't sing in sound. It sang in pattern, randomized bursts, off-key prayer in a spectrum predators used to keep formation. The swarm arrived with the etiquette of locusts, not ship-shaped, not even creature-shaped. The charts drew them as Pinot dust, self-similar malice surfing on math. Where Terran batteries spoke in stone and steel, the swarm dissolved and reassembled too quickly for prediction. Then the choir's clamor hit the ether and their pretty geometry frayed. Cole's voice cut across with a single crisp acknowledgement. "Good paint, museum." It was not a victory. It was a handle. Terran squadrons used the ragged edges to corral shard storms into kill boxes where kinetics did the other job that energy could not. "Not elegant," a Terran gunnery chief said on a hot mic, "but I like alive better than elegant." For 2 days the sky over the far porches moaned with the quiet violence of moving mass. In mess lines and landing queues, Concorde citizens practiced being neighbors. It was not pretty. It was loud and sometimes cruel and often wrong. But every hour the rate of wrong fell. The muscles remembered there had been muscles. On the 3rd day, a basilisk wedge knifed through a weak seam and reached a riparian array over the world-lit marrow. Lyra's bucket line felt it as a tremor that shook clamps free. She burned a cutter's engines red and docked backward, becoming a human fender against physics. A Terran tug slid in and welded them to the rock with a spray of shimmering metal that cooled into a ribbed brace. The Terran pilot gave a thumbs-up through 3 panes of glass and a century of disagreements. When the wedge finally shredded under stone shot, there was no cheer. Only a long exhale that tasted like metal and relief. Admiral Tal, who had not slept, spoke into every channel she owned. "We did not pass a test," she said. "We learned how to study." In the silence that followed, the 40-cycle clock kept ticking, suddenly less like a threat and more like a promise of work left to do. Lyra looked at the drill book again and wrote in its margins with the ugly, necessary handwriting of fatigue. Lesson 1. Neighbors are a technology. Build them. The basilisk tide did not break all at once. It thinned into stubborn eddies that gnawed at seams. Cole's fleet kept the worst of it at the far porches, while the Concorde's new bucket lines matured from jury-rig to craft. The first week's chaos churned into something like culture: posted rosters, whistle codes for air and water, children who could recite their family's evacuation routes the way they once recited confections of moral aphorism. Lyra's array kept painting, and in the noise she found, by accident, the way a hand finds a knotted muscle, the outline of a Terran formation pattern. Not the tempered spirals of a rival, but a set of interleaving arches that seemed designed to catch something slippery without grabbing too hard. She forwarded it to Jaime, who annotated politely, and then to Admiral Tal, who surprised everyone by forwarding it to Cole openly. "Diplomacy," Tal said when Lyra asked, "is a muscle too." Cole's return was immediate and unadorned. Affirmed. Interleaving pattern crown and net. Museum's paint makes it viable in thin swarms. Recommend Concorde deploy decoy lanes, noise corridors, for 3 cycles to herd basilisks away from civilian egress. For the first time, the Concorde's defense board issued an order that assumed the Terrans were partners in a shared profession. Haulers that had been resigned to ferrying freight became chorus members again, singing in phase mistakes. The basilisks, robbed of their pretty geometries, bled into the crown and net and died there, not with fireworks but with the stubborn quiet of work concluding. Admiral Tal took a cutter to the front, an act of leadership some called reckless and others necessary. She docked with a Terran command tender where Rook waited with a whiteboard and a grin sharp enough to be honest. "Your people learn fast," Rook said. "It helps that they were never stupid, just under-practiced." Tal scowled. "If you say strong when standing, I'll file a protest." Rook drew a crown, a net, and a bucket. No slogans, just an invitation to keep doing this on purpose. Lyra stood at the back and listened, taking notes on the chalk squeak. She felt the oddest thing, a loyalty that did not erase old loyalties, bloom like a bruise becoming strength. She had grown up loving the Concorde because it fed children and trimmed cruelty from contract law. She was learning to love a Terran habit of saying the quiet part, that none of those goods survive first contact with entropy unless someone carries a wrench and a will. The battle's decisive hour came not with a flourish, but with a deadline. Cole's fleet had to pivot to intercept a deeper pocket forming beyond the far porches. The crown and net would have to hold in their absence, staffed by crews who 3 weeks before had thought evacuation was a ghost of historical trivia. Tal took the net's central node and made a choice that would have read as barbaric to the old Concorde. She tasked 3 haulers to expend their hulls as kinetic obstacles in a narrow channel if the basilisk surged. She did not do it alone. She put the order to a citizen vote among the crew families owning those ships, presented the math and the likely casualty curves, and sat while people debated, not as passengers, but as proprietors of their fate. All 3 families voted yes by margins that were not unanimous and therefore meant something. They signed their names. The surge came. The haulers burned their reactors dry and rammed 3 points that made a shape on Lyra's scope like a human hand closing on a snake's neck. The crown and net held. When Cole's heavy batteries returned, the rest was a harvest nobody bragged about. The basilisks unraveled in the paint and under the stone and in the end, lost interest in a meal that fought back with organization. Predators prefer prey that doesn't learn. Afterward, when the quiet tasted like clean water, Cole hailed the Concorde in public. "Gravesword terms stand," she said, without triumph. "But you are invited to transit and to trade. A corridor will be marked where your ships will always find fuel, water, and work. We ask a tithe, not coin competence. Maintain drills, audit powers, keep your museums wired for power. Tal nodded, a gesture heavy as ratification. We have learned that we own this piece only in proportion to practice. She paused, and that pride kept as posture rots. Pride kept as promise can be kept. On a small frequency, Lyra's console blinked with a note from Rook. The children want to know if the museum has a sports team. Lyra laughed for the first time in weeks and sent a photo of a volunteer brigade in mismatched vests rolling water drums through a corridor like a relay. Rook replied with the chalkboard. Our sport is keeping. Score by lives. That night the Atlas Ring's south wing turned its lights on without waiting for a gala. Work crews decorated long-stored tools. A sign went up over the old hall of Last Swords, Workshop of Peace. Underneath, smaller letters, Checkout Desk. The museum changed the way a city does when it remembers it is a town. The Hall of Origins became the yard of repairs, where children learned torque by tightening bolts into steel so thick you had to mean it. The Hall of Concord Laws sprouted a counter at which citizens checked out air canisters and med harnesses and returned them cleaner than they had found them. The placard that once called A-17 the last sword now read, The Kept Tool. A new line beneath, A civilization is what it maintains under stress. Archivist Morrow came on opening day in a suit he had not worn since a wedding where the cake had tasted like promises. He rested one long hand on the case and closed his eyes. I worried we were telling a bedtime story too beautifully, he said. You have written a morning. Not alone, Lyra said. She did not look at the skylight because the urge to search for Terran silhouettes had become a superstition she refused to feed. We have neighbors. The 40-cycle deadline arrived without drama. The gravesward reach emptied of Concord flags and filled with Terran hulls that did not advertise ownership so much as appointment. Evacuees wrote home from new towns that learned how to hold buckets and votes at the same time. Trade routes bent, and then settled like bones set properly after long neglect. A corridor marked on every map, ClearPass, guaranteed fuel and water to Concord ships that kept drills logged and audits honest. The price of passage was paperwork you had to be brave to fake. Lyra taught a weekly class called Civic Competence and History, and she refused to apologize for the conjunction. Her students learned to read maps made of silence, and to time how long it took to assemble in the plaza with med kits and names spelled carefully. They staged a debate about emergency powers, and then counted the ballots under the eyes of neighbors who had learned the art of disagreement without reaching for exile. Sometimes Admiral Tal came and said nothing, just stood in the back while children cinched harnesses with their clumsy dignity, and called out readiness every 30 seconds in voices that started thin and grew strong. Once a month, unannounced, a Terran tender slid into orbit, docked quietly, and delivered crates of nothing anybody could call charity. Spares the Concord could have bought but didn't yet know to keep in stock, textbooks that smelled faintly of chalk and oil. Morrow died in his sleep with the drill book open beside his bed and a receipt from the workshop checkout desk on his nightstand. Lyra spoke at his memorial, not about the past but about routines. He taught me to catalog artifacts until the artifacts talked back, she said. He taught me that a story is a tool, and a tool is a promise you mean to keep. Admiral Cole visited once, not with a fleet but with a single escort and 2 schoolchildren who had won an essay contest titled Why We Drill. She walked the yard of repairs without touching anything, as if to prove she trusted the hands already on the tools. "You kept your promise," she said quietly to Lyra. "You turned a mausoleum into a workshop." "We had help," Lyra said, "and an incentive plan." Cole allowed herself the smallest smile. "Predators are an excellent grant committee." She looked at the A-17 case. "We will not always be kind," she said, the sentence unmarred by apology. "But we aim to be useful. When we aren't, you should tell us in math." On the roof of the museum, under a sky that had learned to be watched without being feared, Lyra's console opened a private channel. No header, no ceremony. "Hello, museum," Rook said. "Graduation day." "Not yet," Lyra said, watching a drill form up in the plaza below. Children fell into lines and then into better lines, laughing the way people laugh when they are learning how not to break. "But we've enrolled." "Keep the lights ready," Rook said. "We'll keep the edge." The line clicked shut. Lyra stood for a long time and counted her own breaths in threes, the way Rook had taught the children. In, hold, out, calm. The calm was not an absence. It was a practiced presence, fist unclenched but not empty. She went downstairs and taught a class on Thucydides and bucket brigades, on the Bill of Rights and air valves, on how a people might keep its teeth without biting first. At closing, a child handed back a med harness, coiled neatly. "Do we still need these if the dangerous people are our friends?" he asked. Lyra buckled the harness onto the mannequin again and let the straps sit snug. "We need them," she said, "because friendship isn't a fire brigade. It's a block with more buckets." Night fell gentle as honest work. The Atlas ring glowed not like a halo but like a workshop window left on after hours because someone is still finishing something that matters. Out beyond Clearpass, the Terran fleet moved at the speed of patience. Somewhere past even there reached the dark stirred as it will. The galaxy slept not because danger had ended, but because enough hands had learned where the valves were. Peace, the placard in A-17 now read, is not the absence of strength. It is the choice, renewed daily, to keep your tools sharp and your hands gentle.